Hello, I'm Michael Rebell from Teachers College at Columbia University. I'm very pleased to comment on Linda Darling-Hammond's very perceptive analysis of accountability for the 21st century. What I want to stress is what I call resource accountability for the long term. Now let me begin by noting that we have made substantial progress throughout the United States in the past 30 or 40 years in terms of overcoming the inequities and inadequacies that have plagued our system for financing public education in this country historically, going back 100, 200 years, because much of that system was built on the basis of local property taxes being the predominant form of accountability, of the government's responsibility for funding public education. And that, of course, meant that those localities that had less wealth had less money to spend on the schools for their children. This became a much more significant problem in the 20th century than it had been before, because with the development of urbanization and suburbanization, the differentials between different areas in terms of property wealth became much more dramatic. So as a result, we had a situation where the areas where poor and minority children tended to live were the ones with low property wealth that didn't have the means to support their schools. So ironically, we've had a situation in the United States where the children with the greatest needs were receiving the fewest resources. Now, I mentioned that we've made substantial progress. This matter has gone to the state courts since the U.S. Supreme Court essentially left it to the states, saying that education is not a fundamental interest under the federal Constitution. So litigations have been filed in 45 out of the 50 states over the past 40 years. Plaintiffs have prevailed in 60% of those. And by the way, even in the cases where the plaintiffs have not prevailed, the courts have not necessarily said that the present financing systems in those states are reasonable or pass constitutional muster. They essentially said, for separation of powers reasons, we're not going to look into it. But almost every place where the courts have looked into it, they found problems, and they've taken steps to do something about it. So we are in a better place than we were 40 or 50 years ago. But we still have a lot of work to do. And that's where Linda Darling-Hammond's article comes in, because she does lay out the direction that we need to think about for accountability in terms of programmatic accountability, academic content accountability, and resource accountability. Linda very properly emphasizes the importance of ensuring adequate and equitable funding for all students in our schools. And that means that there has to be extra weighting for students who have greater needs, those who are so-called at risk of not meeting state standards, English language learners, students with disabilities, etc. She also puts a proper emphasis on what we call wraparound services, which are some of the broader services that many of these children need to have a meaningful opportunity to meet the state standards. And that's pretty much what the courts have said throughout the country is the constitutional requirement, where states have challenging state standards, and most states do now. It's reasonable to say, and it's constitutionally required, that all children have a meaningful opportunity to meet those standards. And I also want to mention, this was the report issued by the National Commission on Equity and Excellence in Education about a year ago. Linda served on that committee. I did. We had about 25 representative members of the commission from all across the country, and people who represented a broad spectrum of policy and ideological positions. And I'm very pleased to say, and it took quite some work, we had consensus. We had 100% agreement from people on the right, on the left, people coming from all directions on what the principles of financing of public education, resource accountability should be. I want to talk about 5 principles for what I consider the direction we need for long-term accountability. And this comes out of the experience that we've had in New York State and many other states in the past few years. As a result of the recession, much of the progress that we had made in the pre-recession years, particular orders from courts that were being followed in New York and other states, got scuttled. Constitutional rights don't go on hold because of recessions. So the fact that the state has some financial constraints, it's more difficult to raise taxes politically these days, all of those are realities. But from a constitutional point of view, they shouldn't make a difference. So I think we have to be strategic and savvy in understanding what needs to be done for the future. So let me give you the 5 principles that I'm thinking about. The first is we need to identify the basic courses of study, programs, and resource allocations that are needed to provide an adequate education for all children. And this does mean looking at certain curriculum areas and making sure that all schools and all students are able to provide these. Let me give you a couple of examples. When we examined the situation in New York State, we learned that the state regulations now require 3 years of high school science, but they don't specify what those need to be. So in many schools in inner cities and rural areas, students don't have any access to chemistry or physics, the kinds of courses that they need if they're going to have a real opportunity to go into those fields professionally, which are the areas of great need in this country. Some students don't have that opportunity at all. Now that is not an adequate opportunity for an education. So I think we have to specify with a little more particularity. Another area, courses that have to deal, or extracurricular activities that have to deal with preparation for civic engagement. Now that is the essence of what courts in New York and in at least a dozen states throughout the country have emphasized as being the basic purpose of public education. And that's consistent with our historical understanding of the purposes of public education. So we expected after the court issued its ruling, the state would take a close look at its statutes and regulations and make sure that they really are providing students the skills they need for civic participation. But when the recession hit, what did we learn? The first things that were cut were things like drama, things like model UNs, school newspapers, trips to state legislatures, all service learning, active service learning activities. All of the things that schools had been doing, some schools, some of the time, to provide the kind of engaged preparation for civic activity that the courts, I think, had in mind. And of course, the state needs to notify school districts of what these requirements are, recession or no recession. And they have to make sure that the resources are there to do it. Let me give one more example of a problem in this regard that was widespread in New York and in many places throughout the country, especially post-recession. Even though we have a requirement, a law in New York State that says students with special needs need more time on task. That was required by the court in CFE. So there is a regulation that says students who are not on track to meet the state proficiency standards are entitled to extra tutoring, extra classes, whatever form the local district wants to provide, but they've got to give an extra platform of services to kids who are at risk of not succeeding. Very reasonable, very sensible. But what we found is, even though the law says that all students who have these needs should get this extra service in all the main core subjects, English, math, science, etc., in fact, it was a triage situation. Some children got these services some of the time in some of the subjects. So there again, spelling out what the expectations are and then providing the resources for them is the first necessary building block, and it's got to be clearly done in a strong way so this becomes a permanent requirement of the state. The next area is cost effectiveness. We all have a responsibility to do what we can to keep costs down. We have to emphasize what services students need, not abstract dollar amounts. There's no constitutional right to a certain number of dollars. There is a constitutional right to certain services. So that's another reason why it's important to spell out those services. But then the state does have a responsibility for determining how we can provide those services in the most efficient way. And that means looking at state mandates that may be unnecessary, that may be out of date. It means looking at areas like special education that often are not closely examined from a cost-effectiveness point of view. It means building important new programs like response to intervention in special ed that do have great potential for saving money, but at the same time, not undermining student rights. I think you can provide the same services, in fact, better services to students in a more cost-effective manner if we all really paid attention to this. We have to emphasize all students need to get the services they need. Students at risk need extra services, but we also can be mindful of the budgetary realities here in a way that's constitutionally appropriate. The third area is periodic cost analyses to determine how many dollars, quite frankly, you do need to provide these services in a cost-effective manner. Many states have adopted these cost studies, but it's kind of an ad hoc situation. Sometimes the studies are done by plaintiffs in the litigation, sometimes by legislatures, sometimes by outside consultants. There needs to be more work on honing up the methodologies that are out there. Some of them, quite frankly, can be manipulated for political reasons. So I think we need to do a little more work to find objective ways of fairly determining how many dollars you actually need to provide necessary services in a cost-effective manner. And states should be undertaking these kinds of analyses every 3 or 4 years to keep them current. And the fourth area is to look at the state funding formulas from the point of view of equity and adequacy. Be sure that they are as fair as possible. The court in New York State, in its order, said that you had to revise the formulas to make sure not only that every school district, but every school was getting the resources it needs. And that, of course, means looking for transparency at the local level, how the services are delivered at the local level. I think the kind of dashboard idea that Linda Darling-Hammond mentions in her article makes a lot of sense here. You can track exactly what services are being delivered at the school level for different children and make sure that there is a fair distribution. Final point is what I would call bringing together all of the aspects of resource accountability. Part of this is undertaking what I would call a resource inventory. If we're going to emphasize resource accountability at the school level, I think periodically state officials need to go into the schools and make sure that they all have what they need. And part of that has to do with the FAIR formula. If there's a FAIR formula, presumably on a current basis they're getting what they need. But we also have to dig a little deeper. Capital facilities, for instance. Some schools may be so old, so inadequate, being wired electrically for modern computers and other technology that schools clearly need in the 21st century. I think the notion that is very much in Linda's article about quality review teams comes into play here, because those teams should be looking not only at the academic programs, the teacher competence, the curriculum, they ought to be looking at the resource activities and checking whatever the findings had been on resource accountability, resource inventories, making sure they're up to date. So in sum, I think with these 5 principles, if we identify with some particularity the programs and activities that are needed, if we make sure that they're being provided in a cost-effective manner, if we ensure that we have periodic cost studies done in a fair and objective manner, if we revise our funding formulas to make sure they deliver necessary resources to all districts, resources that are equitable and adequate, and we have a full sense of accountability that includes resource inventories and quality review teams, we will establish a strong system on a stable, permanent basis that can ensure that, in fact, all children in the United States will have a meaningful opportunity for a sound basic education, a thorough and efficient education, the kind of education that clearly is their right as a matter of morals and, quite frankly, as a matter of constitutional law. Thank you.